In September 1945, at the edge of former frontline airfields across the continental United States, long rows of P-51 Mustangs stood immobilized under open skies, their canopies sealed, tires slowly deflating on cracked concrete. The war had ended abruptly, but the machinery of demobilization moved with bureaucratic precision rather than emotion. Aircraft that only months earlier had been logged individually for escort missions were now processed in bulk, identified by serial numbers and storage codes. The transition from wartime urgency to peacetime accounting was immediate and unforgiving. What mattered was not combat performance or historical role, but cost per month of storage and the speed of liquidation. Between 1945 and 1948, the newly separated United States Air Force inherited an aviation inventory designed for a conflict that no longer existed. Jet propulsion, still unreliable but politically and doctrinally inevitable, rendered piston fighters administratively obsolete. The Mustang, optimized for long-range escort at high altitude, no longer fit future planning models based on speed, altitude, and nuclear delivery. Internal memoranda framed the problem in simple terms. Preservation required hangars, corrosion control, manpower, and spare parts. Destruction required rail access and cutting equipment. The outcome was predetermined. At depots such as Kingman and Walnut Ridge, Mustangs were stripped systematically, radios removed, guns welded shut or dismantled, coolant drained from Merlin engines that would never be started again. Some airframes were tagged for potential transfer to Allied nations, but most were reassigned to scrap quotas measured in tons of aluminum per week. Cutting crews worked methodically, slicing wings from fuselages, collapsing structures designed for 400-mile-per-hour flight into raw material for civilian industry. No ceremonies marked the process. Clerks updated ledgers, guards watched perimeters. The aircraft disappeared incrementally. Alongside this institutional logic existed a parallel, unofficial effort. Engineers, mechanics, and a small number of officers attempted to retain technical manuals, engineering drawings, and occasionally complete aircraft, arguing for future research or historical value. These efforts lacked formal authority and depended on personal initiative. Some documentation survived, most did not. In official planning documents, the Mustang was no longer a fighter or even an aircraft, it was excess property. By 1948, the majority of American-built P-51s had been destroyed, sold, or transferred. The disappearance was not dramatic, it was administrative. The aircraft did not fall out of relevance in combat, it was removed by decision tables and budget lines. And yet, as cutting torches worked through the final rows, isolated airframes remained untouched, deferred by paperwork, overlooked by schedules. Their survival was accidental, temporary, and unresolved, leaving open the question of whether the Mustang's story had actually ended. In July 1950, on hastily repaired airstrips carved into the hills of South Korea, P-51 Mustangs appeared again in operational logs of the United States Air Force, not as a result of strategic preference, but as an emergency measure. The outbreak of war exposed the gap between doctrinal expectations and operational reality. Early jet fighters, formally designated as the future of air power, lacked range, endurance, and the ability to operate from damaged or unpaved runways close to the front. The Mustang, formerly obsolete, remained available in storage and could be deployed immediately. Its return was administrative, not symbolic. From the outset, the aircraft was reassigned to missions fundamentally different from those for which it had been designed. Instead of high-altitude escort, Mustangs were tasked with close air support, armed reconnaissance, and battlefield interdiction. The shift carried predictable consequences. The liquid-cooled Merlin engine, an asset at altitude, became a liability at low level, where even light ground fire could puncture coolant lines and force engine seizure within minutes. Loss reports from 1950 to 1951 show that a significant proportion of aircraft were lost not to enemy fighters, but to small arms fire during ground attack sorties. Despite these limitations, the Mustang remained in use because alternatives were insufficient. Jet aircraft consumed more fuel, required longer runways, and could not remain over target areas for extended periods. The P-51 could loiter, could be serviced with limited infrastructure, and could operate from forward strips that jets could not safely use. Training programs were compressed. Fighter doctrine was reduced to attack profiles, emphasizing target identification, weapons delivery, and rapid egress rather than maneuver combat. The aircraft was no longer judged by performance margins, but by availability and endurance. Operational records reveal no illusions about its suitability. Command assessments acknowledged the vulnerability of the type and anticipated continued losses. The Mustang was employed with full awareness of its shortcomings because it filled a temporary role in an unplanned war. As jet technology improved and logistics stabilized, the aircraft was gradually withdrawn again, its Korean service ending not in decisive failure or success, but in calculated replacement. The Mustang's second combat life demonstrated that relevance could be restored by circumstance alone, even when doctrine had already moved on, an adaptation that postponed disappearance but did not prevent it. By the mid-1950s, the P-51 Mustang had almost completely disappeared from frontline units of the United States Air Force, but this withdrawal did not mark the end of its operational life. Instead, the aircraft entered a second geographic phase, moving outward from the centers of technological development toward states whose strategic environment, budgets, and political constraints made jet transition either impossible or undesirable. In this context, the Mustang was no longer evaluated against future concepts of air power, but against immediate national needs and limited alternatives. In Australia, Mustangs filled the gap between wartime piston aviation and the slow arrival of jet fighters, remaining in service well into the early 1950s. In South Africa, the aircraft became a core component of air power, valued for range, payload, and the ability to operate over vast territories with minimal infrastructure. Post-war South Korea, rebuilding its forces after devastation, relied on Mustangs as a foundation of its air arm, not because they were modern, but because they were obtainable, understood, and maintainable. Across Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia, the pattern repeated. Countries unable to finance jet procurement or dependent on foreign approval for advanced systems adopted the Mustang as a long-term solution. In these air forces, the aircraft rarely performed classic air superiority missions. Instead, it was used for border patrols, counterinsurgency operations, anti-guerrilla strikes, and demonstrations of state presence over remote regions. Engagements were typically against irregular forces with limited anti-air capabilities, where endurance and payload mattered more than speed or climb rate. Maintenance records from these states show a gradual divergence from factory standards. Airframes were kept flying through local modifications, cannibalization of stored aircraft, and improvised repair methods. The Mustang became less a standardized product and more a collection of evolving machines adapted to climate, fuel quality, and available expertise. Losses occurred primarily through accidents, mechanical fatigue, and occasional ground fire, reinforcing its role as a working asset rather than a prestige symbol. In this phase, the Mustang survived not through excellence, but through adequacy. It remained useful because it met minimum operational requirements at acceptable cost. The aircraft's continued service demonstrated that obsolescence was relative, defined not by global benchmarks, but by local conditions. As long as jets remained financially or politically out of reach, the Mustang retained relevance. Yet even in these peripheral wars, replacement was inevitable, raising the question of what would happen when usefulness alone was no longer enough to justify its existence. In 1948, as embargoes and diplomatic pressure shaped every procurement decision in the Middle East, the P-51 Mustang entered service with Israel through channels that existed outside formal military supply systems. Aircraft were purchased indirectly, disassembled, moved through third countries, and reassembled under time pressure by personnel with uneven access to documentation and spare parts. The Mustang arrived not as a standardized fleet, but as a collection of airframes with different histories, wear levels, and configurations. From the outset, its employment reflected necessity rather than doctrine, and improvisation replaced planning. Initial sorties were limited in scope and ambition. Mustangs were used for reconnaissance, interception of isolated targets, and strikes against ground infrastructure rather than air superiority. The absence of radar coverage, limited pilot training hours, and inconsistent maintenance capacity forced conservative tactics. Yet the aircraft's range allowed coverage of wide areas with minimal basing, and its payload capacity provided a degree of flexibility unavailable in lighter alternatives. Operational orders emphasized effect over method, leaving crews to adapt in flight. During the Suez Crisis, the Mustang's role shifted further from conventional expectations. By this stage, the aircraft was technologically obsolete by global standards, but still operationally relevant under local conditions. Missions included low-altitude strikes and, most notably, the deliberate severing of ground communications. Flying at extremely low level over the Sinai, pilots used the aircraft to cut telephone lines supplying opposing forces, a task never envisioned by its designers. The tactic was chosen because it worked immediately and required no specialized equipment beyond precise flying. Maintenance logs from this period show increasing divergence from factory specifications. Components were repaired repeatedly beyond intended service limits, and performance margins narrowed. Losses occurred, primarily from ground fire and mechanical failure, but operational tempo remained high because alternatives were scarce. The Mustang was no longer evaluated as a fighter aircraft, but as a tactical platform capable of executing specific tasks under political and logistical constraints. In the Middle Eastern context, the aircraft's continued use demonstrated that relevance could be redefined entirely by circumstance. The Mustang survived not by matching new technologies, but by being adaptable to roles shaped by urgency rather than doctrine. Each sortie moved it further from its original identity, suggesting that its future would depend less on combat value and more on whether such adaptation could continue indefinitely. By the late 1950s, as military operators finally removed the P-51 Mustang from active service, the aircraft entered a civilian environment governed by entirely different incentives and risk calculations. Surplus airframes were sold to private owners at prices determined not by historical value, but by weight of metal and engine hours remaining. In the United States, former combat aircraft were registered as civilian machines, stripped of armament, and reassigned identities through new serial numbers and ownership records. The transition was administrative, but its consequences were technical and often irreversible. Civilian operators were not constrained by military doctrine or wartime safety margins. Instead, competition became the dominant force shaping the Mustang's next life. Air racing, particularly at Reno, transformed the aircraft from a standardized fighter into an experimental platform. Engines were modified far beyond factory specifications, cooling systems redesigned, airframes reinforced, and weight reduced wherever regulations allowed. Power outputs exceeded wartime limits by hundreds of horsepower, pushing speeds well beyond those envisioned by North American engineers in the 1940s. The Mustang was no longer judged by reliability over hundreds of sorties, but by performance over minutes. The results were measurable and dangerous. Accident reports from the 1960s and 1970s document structural failures, engine fires, and pilot fatalities linked directly to extreme modifications. Regulatory authorities responded with restrictions and temporary suspensions, effectively halting major racing events. The aircraft's limits, ignored in pursuit of speed, reasserted themselves through material failure. The pause marked a critical moment. The Mustang could either disappear entirely or be redefined once more. When racing resumed, it did so under tighter rules and improved engineering discipline. Builders applied modern materials, advanced metallurgy, and systematic testing to airframes that were now decades old. Each surviving Mustang became a unique machine, sharing a general outline but little else with its wartime counterparts. Maintenance logs in civilian registries grew more detailed than any military service record, documenting rebuilds, crashes, and recoveries over successive ownership cycles. In this last phase, the Mustang existed neither as a weapon nor as a relic. It was a test bed, a risk-managed experiment sustained by individuals willing to accept responsibility once borne by institutions. Its survival depended entirely on private decision-making, not national strategy. As racing continued and airframes aged, the question shifted again, from how fast the Mustang could go to whether it should continue flying at all, and who would decide its final purpose. By the late 1960s, the P-51 Mustang reached the final boundary of its military relevance in parts of Honduras and El Salvador, where limited budgets and delayed access to jet aircraft prolonged the operational life of piston fighters. In July 1969, during the short but intense conflict later known as the Football War, Mustangs flew combat sorties alongside other piston aircraft, engaging in air combat that had largely disappeared elsewhere in the world. These encounters were not doctrinal throwbacks, but logistical inevitabilities. The aircraft operated within narrow performance margins, maintained by overstretched ground crews and flown by pilots trained for conditions that no longer existed in most air forces. Loss records from this period reflect exhaustion rather than failure. Airframes were worn, spare parts scarce, and maintenance dependent on cannibalization. After 1969, remaining Mustangs were withdrawn not because of decisive defeat, but because continued operation became unsustainable. With their retirement, the aircraft's global military career effectively ended. What followed was not immediate preservation, but fragmentation. Airframes were sold, abandoned, or scrapped, their fate determined by individual owners rather than institutions. In the 1970s and 1980s, a new structure emerged around the surviving aircraft. Restoration groups, museums, and private collectors began consolidating remaining Mustangs into controlled environments. Organizations such as the Commemorative Air Force formalized standards for restoration and flight, emphasizing historical configuration, documented provenance, and regulated operation. The aircraft transitioned from tool to reference object, valued for authenticity rather than utility. Flight hours were counted conservatively, maintenance followed civilian airworthiness rules, and risk was redistributed from state systems to private responsibility. In this final form, the Mustang became selective. Only airframes with sufficient structural integrity and financial backing survived. Each restoration represented thousands of labor hours and extensive archival research. The aircraft no longer served nations or doctrines, but memory frameworks shaped by individuals. Air shows replaced combat zones, and flight plans replaced operational orders. The Mustang's persistence into the present is not the result of technical superiority or strategic necessity. It exists because a series of decisions made independently over decades prevented its disappearance. Governments discarded it. Wars exhausted it. Only deliberate human choice preserved it. In that sense, the aircraft's longest service has been its last one, not in combat, but in continued existence, maintained against the inertia of obsolescence.